we will look at the life of William TYSON HORTON, a man born into the highest echelons of Oklahoma City society, who spent decades believing his father's influence was a shield that would never shatter. We will follow the trail of RUTH EISEMANN-SCHIER, the first woman to ever appear on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, and see how her flight led her to a quiet life as a student in a college town. We will also walk through the crisp, dark autumn of 1968 in Ohio, where Richard LEE TINGLER Jr. left a trail of silence behind him before trying to reinvent himself as a simple farmhand in the red dirt of Oklahoma. We will meet Kenneth Malcolm Christensen, a man of such unique physical stature that his attempt to hide behind the persona of a sophisticated attorney was ultimately undone by the very height he could not conceal. And finally, we will hear the strange, almost cinematic story of William Hutton Cobble, an escape artist who learned that even in the midst of a life of crime, a single act of grace can change the heart of a man. These stories are not told for excitement. They are told to find a sense of order. There is a profound comfort in knowing that justice, though it may move with the slowness of a glacier, is just as powerful. It eventually grinds down the mountains of ego and privilege. As you drift closer to sleep, let the details of these lives wash over you like the rain outside. You do not need to remember the names or the dates. You only need to feel the steady progression of time and the restoration of balance. The world is a place where things eventually come right. The shadows are long, but they always retreat when the sun rises. Listen to the rain. It had been falling on these plains for thousands of years. It fell on the red dirt when Oklahoma City was just a collection of tents, and it falls now on the modern skyline. It is a constant, much like the truth. In the 1940s and 50s, the city was a place of rapid growth and immense opportunity. It was a place where a man with a good business could become a pillar of the community, respected and feared in equal measure. This was the world of the Horton family. They lived in a neighborhood where the lawns were a deep, vibrant green, and the houses were built of solid brick and stone. In such a world, reputation was a currency more valuable than gold. As we prepare to enter the first of our stories, feel your heart rate slowing. Your breathing is steady and deep. The rain is a lullaby, a soft percussion that tells you there is nowhere else you need to be. The history we are about to explore is settled. The people involved have long since met their fates. We are simply turning the pages of an old, leather-bound book, feeling the texture of the paper and the weight of the past. There is a great peace in being a witness to the end of a story. Consider the nature of a safe container. Your room is a safe container. Your bed is a safe container. And this narrative is a safe container for the tragedies of the past. We acknowledge the victims, and we remember their names with a quiet respect. But we do not let the darkness of their experiences enter this room. Instead, we focus on the light of the justice that eventually found them. We focus on the fact that no matter how wealthy, how clever, or how fast a person may be, they cannot outrun the truth forever. The truth is patient. It sits in the corner of the room, waiting for the light to hit it just right. In the 1960s, the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list was a fixture of American life. Their faces stared out from the walls of every post office, black and white photographs of men and women who had stepped outside the boundaries of society. To be on that list was to be a ghost. a person who existed only in the peripheral vision of the public. Tonight, we will see how those ghosts were eventually brought back into the light. We will see how a simple wanted poster in a rural sheriff's office could end a months-long manhunt. We will see how the digital age eventually caught up with a man who thought he had outlived his crimes. The rain is turning to a soft drizzle now, a mist that clings to the trees and the grass. It is a quiet time, a time for reflection and for letting go. You are drifting. The stories are beginning to blend into the sound of the water. You are moving back through time, leaving the modern world behind. The year is 1946. The war is over. The lights of Oklahoma City are bright and full of promise. A young boy is born into a family of means, a boy who will grow up with every advantage, yet who will eventually find himself in the deepest of shadows. As we transition into the life of William Tyson Horton, let your mind wander to the image of a brand new Ford dealership in the 1950s. The smell of fresh wax, the gleam of the chrome bumpers, the pride of a father who has built something lasting. This is where our journey truly begins. It is a story of a safety net that was too strong for too long, and a man who mistook his father's influence for his own invincibility. But as the rain continues to fall, we know how the story ends. We know that the safety net eventually frays. We know that the truth is waiting. Rest now. Let your eyes close if they haven't already. The journey is starting, but you are only a passenger. You are being carried by the narrative, floating on the steady stream of words. There is no effort required. There is only the rain, the history, and the quiet restoration of order. We are moving into the heart of the story now, into the red dirt and the bright lights of a city that was once home to a wealthy son who thought he had escaped justice. But justice, like the rain, always finds its way to the ground. Privilege is a quiet, invisible shield. It softens the world's sharp edges. In the mid-1940s, Oklahoma City was a place defined by its ambition and its dust. The city stretched out across the plains, building a future on the back of oil wealth and the steady, rhythmic hum of new industry. It was into this world of prosperity that William Tyson Horton was born in 1946. He was an only son. His father was a man of significant local stature, owning a Ford dealership that served as a temple of chrome and the promise of the open road. Beyond the cars, the elder Horton owned an amateur baseball team in Texas, a pursuit that signaled a level of leisure few could truly grasp. This was a family that lived in the sun, surrounded by the respect of their peers and the comfort of a well-manicured suburban life. The Horton household was a portrait of the mid-century American dream. At the time, the neighborhood streets were lined with young oak trees, and the air often carried the scent of freshly cut grass. You can almost hear the rhythmic clicking of the oscillating sprinklers as they watered the lawns during the long, humid Oklahoma summers. Within the walls of their home, there was the silence of security. William grew up with every advantage, moving through a world where the furniture was polished and the future seemed mapped out in straight, paved lines. His father was not just a businessman. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose name carried weight in the halls of local government. There is a particular kind of quiet that exists in a showroom full of new cars. It is a scent of unblemished rubber, heavy wax, and the cool touch of metal. As a young man, William spent his days in this environment, surrounded by the symbols of his father's success. However, as the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, a subtle friction began to develop between William and the world around him. While his father sat on the city safety board, a committee dedicated to the preservation of order and the promotion of safe driving, William was discovering a different relationship with the road. He viewed the streets not as a shared space, but as a private playground where the rules were merely suggestions. Between 1963 and 1969, William Tyson Horton accumulated a staggering record of traffic violations. These were not minor infractions, but serious displays of recklessness that would have seen any other young man stripped of his license or sent before a judge. Yet, the shield of his father's influence remained thick and impenetrable. The citations were often minimized, the paperwork seemingly drifting into the quiet corners of administrative offices where they were eventually forgotten. It was a period of profound irony. While the elder Horton worked to ensure the safety of the city's citizens, his son was becoming a ghost on the asphalt, a shadow that moved with total impunity. By the late 1960s, the red dirt of Oklahoma was being paved over by an ever-expanding network of highways. William moved through this landscape in the latest Ford models, the engines purring with a power that he felt belonged solely to him. He was a man who had never known the weight of a consequence. To him, the law was something that applied to the people he saw through his windshield, the ones who didn't have a name that opened doors. But even the strongest shield eventually develops a crack. In 1970, the sheer volume of his recklessness finally became too much for the system to ignore entirely. His driver's license was suspended for 90 days. This period of forced stillness was a turning point. For the first time in his life, William was grounded, unable to use the speed of a car to outrun his own impulses. The quiet of the suburban nights began to feel heavy to him. He spent those months watching the world from the shadows of his porch, or walking the quiet residential blocks where the street lights cast long, amber pools on the pavement. According to those who looked back on this time, the suspension did not teach him a lesson in humility. Instead, it provided the space for a much darker passion to take root. He began to look at the homes of his neighbors, not as part of a community, but as targets. The transition was subtle at first. He started by moving through the backyards of the city, the soft soles of his shoes making almost no sound on the damp grass. He was a student of the mundane details: the time a porch light flickered off, the sound of a deadbolt sliding into place, the rhythm of a household settling into sleep. His first crimes were intrusions of privacy, small burglaries and obscene phone calls that allowed him to exert a terrifying level of control over the lives of others. He was no longer just the reckless son of a wealthy dealer. He was becoming a predator who understood that his father's reputation was the perfect camouflage. In the summer of 1970, the heat in Oklahoma City can be stifling, a thick blanket that makes every movement feel deliberate. It was during one of these sweltering nights that William moved from burglary to violence. He targeted a woman in his own community, using chloroform to ensure her silence, a cold and clinical method that suggested a terrifying level of preparation. This was the beginning of a 13-year shadow history. While he maintained the appearance of a respectable young man from a good family, he was secretly building a record of assaults and rapes that haunted the women of the city. He moved through the decades with a sense of total entitlement, a man who believed that the world owed him whatever he chose to take. Not long after his first violent assault, the pattern of his life became one of public privilege and private horror. He continued to benefit from high-priced attorneys and the lingering shadow of his father's status. Even when he was arrested for soliciting or assault, the gavel seemed to fall with a strange softness. The legal maneuvers were as polished as the cars in the family showroom. But as we look back from the safety of the present, we see that the clock was already ticking. The decades of the 70s and 80s were passing, and with each year, the weight of his actions was growing heavier, pressing down on the glass wall he had built around himself. The stillness of the Oklahoma nights was about to be broken by a woman who refused to stay silent. Wealth provides a specific kind of silence. It is a heavy, golden veil. In the heart of Oklahoma, that silence was often paved with the red dust of the plains and the promise of a new era. William Tyson Horton was born into this quietude in 1946, a year when the world was beginning to breathe again after the long exhaustion of war. His arrival was marked by the comfort of a family that had already secured its place in the sun. The city was growing. Beneath the vast, open sky, the Horton family name became synonymous with the gleaming promise of the American automotive dream. His father was a man of significant stature, the owner of a Ford dealership that served as a local landmark of prosperity and progress. Inside that showroom, the air was thick with the scent of fresh rubber, floor wax, and the quiet pride of a self-made empire. To understand the trajectory of William's life, one must picture the Oklahoma City of the late 1940s and 50s. It was a place of rapid expansion, where the red soil was being covered by the concrete of new suburbs and the bright neon of commerce. The Horton Ford dealership was more than a business. It was a pillar of the community, a place where the local residents came to buy their first family cars or the trucks that would work the nearby fields. The elder Horton was a man who understood the value of reputation. He was not merely a businessman, but a civic leader, a man whose influence extended into the very fabric of the city's governance. He even reached across the state line into Texas, where he owned an amateur baseball team. Imagine the long, hot summers spent in the bleachers, the sound of a wooden bat connecting with a ball, and the smell of parched grass. This was the leisure of the wealthy, a world where the struggles of the average person felt very far away. Within the Horton household, life moved with a rhythmic, predictable grace. The lawns were kept in a state of emerald perfection, the sprinklers clicking in a steady, hypnotic pulse during the heat of the afternoon. Inside, the rooms were cool and spacious, filled with the quiet ticking of clocks and the soft rustle of fine linens. William was the only son, the heir to this kingdom of chrome and steel. He was a child of immense privilege, growing up in an environment where every need was met before it was even voiced. In this era, a family's standing was measured by the polish on their car and the height of their fences. The Hortons had both. But as the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, the polished surface of this life began to show the first faint signs of a fracture. As William entered his teenage years, the freedom afforded by his father's wealth began to manifest in a troubling way. In a city built for the automobile, the road became his private domain. Between the years of 1963 and 1969, a period when most young men were finding their footing in the world, William was creating a ledger of recklessness. He accumulated dozens of serious traffic violations, ranging from excessive speeding to dangerous maneuvers that put others at risk. In any other household, such a record would have resulted in the immediate loss of a license, or perhaps a stern intervention by the authorities. But the name on the citations carried a weight that the local officers could not ignore. The irony of the situation was as thick as the Oklahoma humidity. While William was treating the city streets like a racetrack, his father was serving as a prominent member of the city's safety board. This was a body dedicated to the promotion of safe driving practices and the reduction of traffic accidents. One can imagine the board meetings held in wood-paneled rooms, where men in suits discussed the importance of caution and the sanctity of the law. It is a striking image. The father advocating for the safety of the public, while his own son was one of the most consistent violators of those very standards. Because of his father's position, the consequences for William's actions were repeatedly softened, minimized, or entirely erased. He was learning a dangerous lesson in the shadows of his father's influence, that the rules were structures designed for the protection of others, but they did not necessarily apply to him. This period of William's life was characterized by a sense of total impunity. He moved through the world with the confidence of a man who knew that any mistake could be polished away, much like a scuff on a new fender in his father's showroom. The wealth acted as a buffer, a soft layer of insulation that kept the reality of his actions from ever truly reaching him. He was a young man who had never been told no in a way that mattered. The traffic tickets were mere slips of paper, easily handled by high-priced attorneys or quiet conversations behind closed doors. To the outside world, he was still the respectable son of a wealthy dealer, a young man with a bright future ahead of him. But beneath the well-tailored clothes and the expensive cars, a darker impulse was beginning to take root, nourished by the knowledge that he could operate outside the boundaries of the law. By 1970, however, the sheer volume of his violations became impossible to ignore, even for those who wished to look the other way. The legal system, which had been so flexible for so long, finally reached a point where a gesture of discipline was required. His driver's license was suspended for 90 days. For a young man who defined himself by his mobility and his control over the machine, this was a moment of forced stillness. It was a period of 90 days where he was tethered to the ground, unable to use the roads as his playground. In the quiet of that suspension, the recklessness that had previously been confined to the asphalt began to find a new, more predatory outlet. Without the distraction of the car, William turned his attention toward the lives of those around him. The privilege that had protected him for so long had also isolated him, creating a vacuum that he sought to fill with power and control. The transition was subtle at first. It began with small intrusions, a burglary in a neighbor's apartment, an obscene phone call made from the safety of his home. These were tests of the boundaries he had so often flouted on the road. he was exploring the shadows of the very community his father helped lead. We can see now, through the lens of history, that this was the moment the trajectory changed. The safety net of wealth and influence was still there, but it was being stretched thin by the weight of a growing darkness. The stillness of 1970 was not a period of reflection for William, but a period of incubation. He was no longer just a reckless son of a dealer. He was becoming a man who viewed other people as objects to be manipulated. As the 90-day suspension came to an end, the world he returned to was the same. But he was not. The golden veil of his family's reputation remained intact for the time being. But the first real shadows were beginning to fall across the perfectly manicured lawns of his youth. The order of the Horton household was about to be challenged by a reality that no amount of influence could fully suppress. The transition from reckless youth to a more calculated shadow occurred with an unsettling, quiet deliberation. In 1970, as the red dust settled on the suburban streets of Oklahoma City, William Tyson Horton moved from the speed of the open road to the stillness of the neighborhood apartment complex. He began with a burglary, a silent intrusion into a space where he did not belong. The air in the rooms he entered often smelled of lavender and stale coffee, the mundane sense of a life he sought to disrupt. Then came the phone calls. The rhythmic clicking of the rotary dial was often the only sound in his darkened study as he reached out to strangers, his voice a low, anonymous intrusion into their private evenings. These were small fractures in the social contract, signals of a growing hunger for a different kind of control. The escalation was as inevitable as the changing of the seasons. Eventually, Horton committed his first rape, using chloroform to ensure the silence of his victim. The chemical scent of the anesthetic lingered in the hallways like a heavy, unseen mist. For the next 13 years, he maintained a double life that seemed to defy the very laws of probability. To the casual observer, he was still the son of a prominent businessman, a man who moved through the city with the confidence of someone who owned the ground beneath his feet. But to the women of Oklahoma City, he was a predator who operated with a sense of total impunity. The court records from this era suggest a man who viewed the legal system not as a barrier, but as a series of puzzles to be solved. He solicited prostitutes and committed further assaults. His father's influence and high-priced attorneys acting as a shield that repeatedly deflected the consequences of his actions. The shield finally cracked in 1983, in an incident marked by a staggering lack of humanity. Horton used a knife to cut the throat of a woman he had solicited. The violence was sudden, a sharp departure from the calculated shadows of his earlier crimes. Miraculously, the woman survived. Her resilience became the catalyst for a change that the city's safety board could no longer prevent. Horton was arrested and brought into a courtroom, the sterile fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished wood of the benches. Yet, even as the gavel prepared to fall, he had one final maneuver. While awaiting his sentencing, he managed to convince the bail bondswoman who had posted his bond to abandon her life and flee with him. They disappeared into the vast, rolling landscape of the American Midwest. The trail led eventually to Kansas City, Missouri, where they lived in the quiet anonymity of a transient lifestyle. When the authorities finally located him a few months later, the room he occupied was a stark contrast to the luxury of his youth. Inside, investigators found a single, chilling piece of evidence: a pair of boys' underwear. The local police noted that Horton's physical description matched that of a man responsible for a string of rapes in the Kansas City area. While he was evading capture in Missouri, the judge in Oklahoma had grown tired of the delays. In his absence, the court sentenced Horton to 60 years in the state penitentiary. The wealth and the names and the influence had finally reached their limit. The years that followed were marked by the slow, grinding passage of time behind stone walls. Horton served 27 years of his sentence. Inside the prison, the world outside continued to accelerate, moving from the analog era of his youth into the digital age of the new millennium. By the time he was granted release in 2010, he was 64 years old. His hair had thinned, and his movements were slower, dictated by the stiffness of age rather than the agility of a predator. He was placed in a safe community, a residential area specifically designated for registered sex offenders. It was a place of regulated schedules and constant monitoring, or so the public was led to believe. The impulses that had defined his life in the 1960s and 70s remained unchanged by the decades of confinement. Almost immediately upon his release, Horton began cruising the streets of Oklahoma City once more. He looked for the same vulnerabilities he had exploited 40 years earlier. However, the city was no longer the place of his father's influence. In the digital age, a new kind of sentinel had emerged. A local video vigilante, operating through a website known as johntv.com, had spent years documenting the activities of the city's shadow economy. This observer captured Horton on camera, his vehicle moving slowly through the areas where he sought his victims. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to identify the man who had once thought himself untouchable. Reports began to surface from women on the street that Horton was not just looking for companionship, but was engaging in acts of kidnapping and violent sodomy. There were even more disturbing allegations that he was seeking out drug addicts with young children, offering cash for access to the most vulnerable members of society. The law, which had once been so slow to move against him, now acted with a clinical efficiency. Within days of the vigilante's reports, Horton was arrested on multiple counts of assault with a deadly weapon and kidnapping. The final chapter of his life did not take place in a courtroom or a luxury home, but in the quiet, sterile environment of a custody medical wing. In 2011, while awaiting trial for his latest crimes, William Tyson Horton died. The noise he had created throughout his life, the screeching tires of his youth, the cries of his victims, the legal arguments of his attorneys, was finally replaced by a permanent silence. The wealth of the Ford dealership and the prestige of the safety board were distant memories, unable to follow him into the finality of his cell. The order of the world, though delayed for decades, had finally been restored. As the rain continues to fall against the glass tonight, we can recognize that the passage of time eventually brings every story to its necessary conclusion. There is a peace in knowing that the shadows, no matter how long they stretch, eventually succumb to the light of the truth. The transition from the life of a single predator to a coordinated conspiracy often reveals a different kind of darkness, one where the mechanics of the crime are as chilling as the intent. while the story of William Tyson Horton ended in the quiet of a modern cell. We must travel back to a different era of shadow. To the winter of 1968 in the city of Atlanta. The air was crisp with the approach of Christmas, and the streetlights cast long, amber glows over the suburban landscapes of Georgia. In this world of mid-century stability, the Mackle family represented the pinnacle of the American dream. Robert Mackle was a wealthy land developer, a man whose success was built on the very soil that would soon become a source of profound terror for his daughter, Barbara. Barbara Mackle was a 20-year-old student at Emory University, a young woman whose life was defined by the bright promise of the future. But in the early hours of December 17th, that promise was interrupted by a knock on a motel room door. Barbara had been staying at a local roadway inn with her mother, Jane, as she recovered from a bout of the flu. The room was warm, filled with a scent of tea and the soft rustle of bed sheets, a safe container against the December chill. When the door opened, the safety of that room vanished. Two individuals stood there, Gary Stephen Christ and his 26-year-old girlfriend, RUTH EISEMANN-SCHIER. They were not there for a simple robbery. They had spent months preparing for a crime that would challenge the boundaries of human endurance. The kidnapping was executed with a clinical, almost detached efficiency. Barbara was taken from the room, leaving her mother bound and gagged and driven into the remote wooded areas of Gwinnett County. The landscape there was a tapestry of pine needles and damp earth, a place where the sounds of the city were muffled by the dense canopy of trees. It was here that Christ and Scheer revealed the centerpiece of their plan. It was a box, roughly 7 feet long and 3 feet wide, constructed of plywood and reinforced with fiberglass. To look at it was to see a strange, utilitarian object, but its purpose was singular. It was designed to be a temporary grave. Inside the box, the kidnappers had installed a rudimentary life support system. There were 2 plastic ventilation tubes, 2 inches in diameter, meant to reach up through the soil to the surface air. There was a small battery-operated fan to circulate the oxygen, a single light bulb, and a meager supply of water laced with sedatives and a few pieces of bread. The technical nature of the box suggested a terrifying level of premeditation. It was a calculated risk, a gamble on the physics of survival. They forced Barbara into the narrow space, and as the lid was fastened, the world of light and sound began to shrink. The sound of the first shovel of dirt hitting the wood must have been a heavy, rhythmic thud. As the earth was piled on top, the weight of the Georgia soil began to press down, sealing the box in a cold, subterranean embrace. Christ and Scheer drove away, leaving a ransom note demanding $500,000 in exchange for the location of the girl they had just buried alive. Above ground, the woods returned to their natural silence. The wind moved through the pines, and the frost began to settle on the red clay. Below ground, Barbara Mackle began a journey into the absolute limits of the human psyche. For 83 hours, time ceased to function in its traditional sense. In the darkness of the box, there was no sunrise or sunset, only the steady, mechanical hum of the small fan and the faint, rhythmic sound of her own breathing. The air that came through the plastic tubes was damp and smelled of the surrounding earth, a constant reminder of the thin line between life and the void. To maintain her sanity, Barbara engaged in a process of mental preservation, She would later recount how she spent the hours imagining she was decorating a Christmas tree with her family, visualizing the placement of every ornament and the glow of every light. She moved through the rooms of her home in her mind, touching the furniture and smelling the familiar scents of her kitchen. The physical environment was one of heavy stillness. The light bulb eventually flickered and died, leaving her in a darkness so thick it felt like a physical weight. The water she drank was cold and the bread was dry, but she consumed them with a deliberate focus on survival. She listened to the earth. She listened for the sound of footsteps, for the sound of a shovel, for any sign that the world above had not forgotten her. The silence was punctuated only by the occasional scurrying of a small animal on the ground above, or the distant, muffled sound of a car engine. In those moments, the isolation was absolute. While Barbara waited in the dark, the world above was in a state of high alert activity. J. Edgar Hoover himself took a personal interest in the case, directing a massive FBI operation to track the kidnappers and secure the ransom drop. The first attempt to deliver the money at Biscayne Bay in Florida was a chaotic failure, as local police inadvertently stumbled onto the scene, causing Christ and Scheer to flee into the swamps. The tension was palpable, a stark contrast to the frozen, quiet world Barbara occupied beneath the Georgia pines. Her father, Robert, was a man of action, but in this moment, he was reduced to a state of agonizing helplessness, waiting for a signal from the shadows. The transition from the frantic energy of the search to the eventual discovery was a slow, deliberate process. After a second, successful ransom drop, the kidnappers provided a vague set of directions to a remote hillside. The FBI agents who arrived at the scene found themselves in a landscape that looked entirely undisturbed. There were no markers, no signs of a struggle. They had to rely on the sound of a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from beneath the soil. It was the sound of Barbara, using her last strength to knock against the wood of her prison. As the agents began to dig, the heavy layers of earth were peeled back, and the plywood lid was finally exposed to the morning light. When they opened the box, they found Barbara Mackle alive, her eyes squinting against the sudden brightness, a survivor of a trial that had lasted 83 hours in the deep, silent dark. Her rescue was a restoration of the order that had been so violently disrupted, a moment of profound relief that signaled the beginning of the end for her captors. As we consider the weight of that silence, we prepare to follow the path of the woman who helped build that box, as she fled into the heart of the country, seeking a new identity in the quiet suburbs of the Midwest. The path diverged in the wake of the failed ransom. The plan had dissolved under the weight of the investigation, leaving the two conspirators to seek their own exits from the stage they had so violently set. While Gary Christ was eventually found in the humid, tangled swamps of Florida, Ruth Eisemann-SCHIER took a different direction. She moved toward the vast, open plains where the sky seems to press down upon the red earth. She arrived in Norman, Oklahoma, during the quietest part of the winter. The town was still. She walked through the university gates, her presence unnoticed by the students who were returning from their holiday breaks. To the observers on the street, she was merely another young woman with her collar turned up against the biting wind. She carried a stack of textbooks that felt heavy and substantial in her arms, a physical weight that served to anchor her new identity. In this new life, the 26-year-old woman became a 19-year-old student. She enrolled at the University of Oklahoma, moving through the campus with a calculated, rhythmic grace. Think of the environment she chose as her sanctuary. The university was a world of structured hours and predictable patterns. She attended lectures in halls that smelled of old paper and citrus-scented floor wax. She sat in the library under the soft, green glow of the shaded lamps. Her face bent over pages of history and science. To those around her, she was a quiet peer, perhaps a bit reserved, but entirely unremarkable. She lived in a small apartment where the radiator hissed and clattered in the night, a mechanical companion that filled the silence of her solitude. She was a fugitive on the most wanted list, yet she was participating in the most mundane rituals of American youth. The FBI had placed her on the 10 most wanted list on December 28, 1968. She was the first woman to ever receive that distinction, a fact that would later become a cornerstone of her historical legacy. The agency distributed circulars featuring her photograph, a face that was now being seen by thousands of people every day. Yet, for 79 days, she remained a ghost in the heart of the country. There is a profound irony in her choice of disguise. She was hiding in a place defined by the pursuit of knowledge and the verification of facts. She walked past the campus security officers and sat in cafes where the local news was discussed, all while the memory of the Georgia woods was being analyzed by investigators across the nation. She lived a life of suspended reality, where every bell that tolled for the change of classes was a reminder of the time she was successfully stealing from the law. But the reach of the investigation was as steady as the turning of the seasons. The FBI's memory is not easily clouded by a change of scenery or a different name. By early March, the leads began to coalesce around the quiet college town. The mechanical precision of the search eventually brought agents to the campus of the University of Oklahoma. On March 5, 1969, the disguise finally failed. There was no dramatic chase through the campus quad, and no voices were raised in the quiet afternoon air. When the agents approached her, the 19-year-old student simply ceased to exist, and RUTH EISEMANN-SCHIER returned to the light of public scrutiny. She was taken into custody without incident, the textbooks and the student identity left behind in the silent apartment. The legal proceedings were conducted with a clinical detachment. RUTH pleaded guilty to her role in the kidnapping, a decision that avoided the spectacle of a long and drawn-out trial. She was sentenced to 7 years in prison, a period of time that allowed the intense public interest to slowly fade into the background of the decade's more pressing news. She served 4 of those years within the structured confines of the correctional system. During that time, the story of the 83 hours Barbara Mackle spent in the dark became the subject of books and films, turning the tragedy into a piece of cultural history. RUTH herself remained a quiet figure behind the walls, a woman whose name was synonymous with a unique kind of criminal audacity. When her parole was granted, it came with a specific condition. She was to be deported to her native Honduras, effectively ending her time in the United States. The transition was a shift from the cold, dry winds of the Oklahoma plains to the tropical, heavy heat of Central America. She left behind the notoriety and the headlines, seeking a life of total obscurity in a place where the American media had no reach. Today, Ruth lives as a grandmotherly figure, her life marked by the simple domestic routines of a woman who has long since made peace with her past. Her name occasionally surfaces in books about historical criminals, but she herself has chosen the path of silence. The contrast between the two kidnappers is stark. While Ruth retreated into a life of quiet anonymity, Gary Christ found himself unable to escape the gravity of his own nature. Though he was eventually pardoned and even sought to become a doctor, he could not maintain the order he had regained. He lost his medical license and eventually returned to the world of crime, finding himself once again in the hands of the law decades later. Ruth, however, remained in the shadows. As we consider the end of her story, we see a woman who participated in a nightmare and then spent the rest of her life ensuring she would never be heard from again. The red dust of Norman has long since settled, and the university bells continue to toll for new generations of students who have no memory of the fugitive who once walked among them. We leave the quiet of Honduras now, moving toward a different kind of darkness that took hold in the autumn of the same year. On the morning of September 16th, 1968, the city of Cleveland was just beginning to stir beneath a heavy blanket of lake-effect fog. It was a Monday, the kind of day where the air holds a hint of the coming winter, smelling of damp earth and the faint, sweet scent of decaying leaves. In a local park where the grass was still lush from the summer rains, a groundskeeper began his morning rounds. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of his boots on the gravel path and the distant, muffled sound of traffic. Near a cluster of ancient oak trees, he came upon a scene that seemed at first like a group of sleepers resting in the shade. But as he drew closer, the stillness of the figures became heavy and unnatural. There, 4 lives had reached a quiet and abrupt conclusion. 3 men and 1 woman were found resting on the cooling earth, their positions almost peaceful. The investigation would later reveal that each had been shot in the head with a clinical precision that suggested a total lack of hesitation. There were no signs of a struggle, no scuffed turf or torn clothing to suggest a fight for survival. It was as if the violence had arrived with the suddenness of a summer storm and departed just as quickly, leaving only the dew to settle over the remains. The police moved through the park with hushed voices, their flashlights cutting through the gray mist as they gathered the meager evidence left behind. The victims were identified, their histories mapped out. But the motive remained as elusive as the fog lifting off Lake Erie. As September turned to October, the investigation in Cleveland simmered, the leads growing cold as the nights grew longer. The state of Ohio seemed to hold its breath, unaware that the shadow was moving south toward the capital. On the night of October 20th, the air in Columbus was crisp, the kind of evening where people retreated into the warmth of their homes and the glow of their television sets. At a local dairy store, the routine of the day was winding down. The hum of the large refrigerated cases provided a steady, mechanical heartbeat to the room, and the smell of fresh milk and wax paper filled the air. Inside, 2 teenagers were finishing their shifts, their minds likely on the school week ahead or the quiet comfort of their own beds. A 15-year-old boy and an 18-year-old girl were performing the final tasks of the night, mopping the floors, tidying the shelves, and counting the modest receipts from the evening sales. They were joined by the store manager, a woman who took pride in the order and safety of her shop. The mundane sounds of closing, the rattle of keys, the sliding of the deadbolt, the soft scratching of a pen against a ledger, were suddenly interrupted. A man entered the space, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from domestic quiet to something far more sterile and dangerous. He moved with a calculated efficiency, showing no emotion as he took control of the room. He bound the two teenagers hand and foot, using the very materials found within the store to secure them. He gagged them to ensure the silence of the night remained unbroken. There was a terrible, clinical detachment in his movements, a sense that he was performing a task rather than committing an act of malice. He beat them with a heavy hand, and then, with the same cold deliberation seen in the Cleveland Park, he shot them both in the back of the head. The sound of the automatic pistol was sharp and brief, swallowed quickly by the insulation of the dairy cases. He then turned his attention to the manager. He beat her severely, attempting to end her life with a wire coat hanger, leaving her for dead on the floor of the store she had cared for so diligently. The man vanished into the Columbus night, leaving behind a scene of absolute stillness. But the manager possessed a resilience that he had not accounted for. Despite the brutality of the assault, she remained conscious, her breath shallow but steady in the quiet store. She became the living memory of that night, the key that would eventually unlock the identity of the shadow. The investigation soon centered on a man named Richard Lee Tingler Jr. He was a native of Portsmouth, a town tucked into the hills of southern Ohio along the river. To those who knew him, he was a man of few words, a figure who seemed to exist on the periphery of society. The FBI, however, saw him differently, describing him as a cold and calculating individual who moved through the world without a conscience. By December, Tingler's face was printed on posters across the country, his name added to the 10 most wanted list. He had become a ghost, a phantom that the authorities chased through the dying embers of the year. The state of Ohio remained on edge, the memory of the 6 lives lost in Cleveland and Columbus hanging over the winter months like a heavy frost. But Tingler was no longer in the state. He had looked toward the horizon, toward the vast, open plains, where a man might reinvent himself through the simple, honest labor of the land. He headed west, leaving the cold October of Ohio behind, seeking a place where the red dirt and the endless sky might swallow his past whole. Justice, however, was already beginning its slow and inevitable journey toward the farmhouse where he thought he was safe. In the early months of 1969, a man known only as Don Williams arrived in Washita County, Oklahoma. He was looking for work. He found it on a farm near the small community of Dill City, a place where the red earth meets an endless sky. To the locals, he was simply another quiet hand who didn't mind the dust or the heat. He was a reliable worker. He kept his head down and his business to himself. For months, he lived within the rhythmic cycles of the land, moving from the cold mornings of late winter into the blooming warmth of an Oklahoma spring. The farmhouse where he stayed was a place of deep stillness. The only sounds were the creak of the windmill, and the distant lowing of cattle across the plains. It was a life built on the mundane details of survival. He spent his days hauling feed and tending to the machinery, perhaps believing that the shadows of Ohio were far enough away to be forgotten. The employer who hired him grew to appreciate the man's steady presence. Don Williams was a man of few words, but his labor was honest and his conduct was beyond reproach. In a small town like Dill City, a good worker is a valued asset. And for a time, the fugitive found a strange kind of peace in the anonymity of the fields. He watched the sun rise over the wheat and felt the heavy, warm air of the southern plains settle around him. He was a ghost inhabiting a living body, a man who had traded a name for a paycheck and a violent past for a quiet future. But the world has a way of shrinking when we least expect it. The long arm of the law does not always move with a flourish. Often, it moves through the simple, everyday actions of observant citizens. On the morning of May 19th, 1969, the employer had a routine errand to run. He drove into town and stepped into the Ouachita County Sheriff's Office. It was a typical Monday morning. The air in the office likely smelled of stale coffee and old paper. While he waited to speak with an official, his eyes drifted toward the bulletin board on the wall. It was a familiar sight in any rural station. A cluttered mosaic of notices, public warnings, and wanted posters. His gaze settled on a specific flyer distributed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The face staring back at him was unmistakably that of his hired hand. The name printed below the photograph was not Don Williams. It was Richard Lee Tingler Jr. The employer was a cautious man. He did not react with the scene. Instead, he left the office and sought out a neighbor, someone he trusted to provide a second set of eyes. He asked the neighbor to go down to the sheriff's office and look at that same poster. He needed to be certain before he invited the law onto his property. The neighbor followed through, standing in the quiet office and comparing the physical description on the paper to the man they both knew from the farm. The height, the build, and the facial features were a perfect match. The realization was a heavy weight. The man they had shared meals with and worked alongside was the same individual sought for 6 brutal murders in Ohio. The notification was made quietly. That same afternoon, the silence of the Dill City farmhouse was interrupted. A team of FBI agents and deputies from the Ouachita County Sheriff's Office moved in with clinical precision. They found Tingler at the house, caught in a moment of total surprise. Though he was armed with a small .25 caliber automatic pistol, the transition from Don Williams back to Richard Lee Tingler Jr. happened without a struggle. The ruse had reached its natural end. The handcuffs were a cold reality against his wrists, marking the final conclusion of his flight. Tingler was returned to the state of Ohio to face the consequences of the dark October of 1968. In a courtroom far from the red dirt of Oklahoma, he was originally sentenced to die in the electric chair. However, the legal landscape shifted in the years that followed, and his sentence was eventually commuted to life in prison. He spent the next 26 years within the walls of a cell. The vast horizons of Dill City replaced by the gray stone of the correctional system. On March 18, 1995, he passed away in a Columbus hospital due to organ failure. He was 74 years old. The story of the man who tried to hide in the wheat fields ended in the quiet, sterile air of a medical ward. The order of the world finally restored. We leave the plains of Oklahoma now, as the sun sets over the Washita River, and we travel toward the coast, where another man of height and shadow was beginning his own journey into the history of the most wanted. The California Institution for Men at Chino was designed to feel less like a fortress and more like a campus, a place where the air smelled of eucalyptus and the coastal fog often rolled in during the early morning hours. On Christmas Eve of 1963, while the rest of the world was wrapping gifts and lighting candles, Kenneth Malcolm Christensen was looking at the horizon. He was a man who had already been sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of 5 years to life for armed robbery, a weight that would crush most spirits. But Christensen was not a man of small stature or quiet ambition. He stood 6 feet and 5 inches tall, a height that made him a landmark in any room he entered. His frame was lean, weighing only 160 pounds, which gave him a narrow, almost skeletal appearance. To compensate for his towering height, he carried himself with a permanent stoop. His shoulders rolled forward as if he were trying to fold himself into a smaller space. His skin told the story of his life before the cell. On his right forearm, a heart and a dagger were etched into the flesh, accompanied by a scroll that read, "Love to Dad." On his left, the symbols of the sea, an anchor and the initials USN, spoke of a past in the Navy. These were not the marks of a man who intended to stay hidden. Yet on that holiday night, he vanished from the prison grounds. He stepped out of the institutional life and into the cool, dark freedom of the California night. What followed was not a desperate spree of chaotic violence, but a calculated series of performances. Christensen understood that people see what they expect to see. He traded his prison denim for the fine wool of tailored suits. He purchased a leather briefcase, its brass latches clicking with the sound of professional authority. He began to travel through Arizona and California, moving between bustling cities and quiet desert towns. He did not wear a mask or shout commands. Instead, he walked into banks, jewelry stores, and high-end restaurants with the calm, scholarly air of a successful attorney. He would ask to speak with the manager, his stooped posture making him appear non-threatening and perhaps a bit overworked. Once he was invited into the privacy of a back office, the briefcase would be opened. Inside were not legal briefs or contracts. There was the cold steel of a weapon and the quiet demand for the contents of the safe. It was a white-collar approach to a blue-collar crime, a ruse that allowed him to walk out of the front door before anyone realized a robbery had even occurred. He moved through the dry, heat-shimmered streets of Phoenix and the salt-aired avenues of coastal California, always maintaining the persona of the professional man on important business. In the jewelry stores he targeted, the velvet displays of diamonds and gold would catch the soft overhead light as he discussed fictitious legal matters with the owners. He was a master of the quiet intrusion. He knew that a man in a suit is rarely questioned, and a man with a briefcase is assumed to have a purpose. For months, the attorney bandit moved through the American West, his height and his tattoos hidden beneath the disguise of respectability. But the FBI was watching the pattern. They were tracing the path of the tall man with the briefcase. noting the stooped shoulders and the distinctive height that no amount of tailoring could fully disguise. On July 27, 1964, his name was added to the list of the nation's most wanted fugitives. The net was beginning to close around the man who thought he could outrun his own shadow. As the investigators began to distribute his likeness to every precinct and post office across the country, the humid air of the Maryland coast in late summer carries a different weight than the dry heat of the Arizona desert. By September of 1964, Kenneth Malcolm Christensen had crossed the vast breadth of the American landscape, placing 3,000 miles between himself and the perimeter fences of Chino. He settled in Silver Spring, a quiet suburb of Washington, D.C., where the streets were lined with mature oak trees and the pace of life felt orderly and predictable. It was a place where a man in a well-tailored suit could move without suspicion, blending into the morning commute of government workers and professionals. Christensen maintained a disciplined routine, keeping his briefcase close and his stooped shoulders hidden beneath the structured lines of expensive wool jackets. He was a man living a fiction, a fugitive who had successfully reinvented himself as a member of the very legal system that had once sought to contain him. The seafood restaurants of the Maryland suburbs were bustling in those days, filled with the sounds of clinking silverware and the low, steady hum of conversation. On one particular evening, Christensen chose a local establishment for what would become his final performance. He entered the building with the practiced ease of an attorney arriving for a late-night consultation. The air inside smelled of melted butter, lemon, and the faint, briny scent of the Chesapeake Bay. He moved toward the manager's office, his 6'5" frame making him a prominent figure in the dimly lit dining room. To the patrons at the tables, he was merely a tall, scholarly man with a briefcase, perhaps a bit tired from a long day at the office. There was no sense of impending crisis, only the steady rhythm of a successful business closing out its day. The ruse of the attorney bandit relied entirely on the projection of quiet authority. When Christensen requested a private audience with the manager, he did so with a calm, steady voice that brooked no argument. Inside the office, away from the eyes of the diners, the briefcase was opened not to reveal legal documents, but to facilitate a robbery. It was a clinical process, devoid of the frantic energy often associated with such crimes. Christensen remained composed, his stooped posture hovering over the desk as he made his demands. He believed that his disguise was impenetrable, that the man the FBI was searching for was a ghost haunting a different coast. He did not realize that the image of his distinctive profile had already preceded him, carried across the country by the very mail trucks that traveled these same Maryland roads. The arrival of the law was not marked by sirens or the screeching of tires. Instead, it was a quiet, inevitable presence that filled the restaurant as local officers and federal agents moved into position. They did not need to use force to dismantle Christensen's carefully constructed persona. As the investigators entered the office, the attorney simply ceased to exist, leaving only the escapee from California. There was a profound silence as the reality of the situation settled over the room. The stoop in his shoulders, once a detail of a disguise, now seemed like the physical weight of the years he had tried to outrun. He was taken into custody without a struggle, the briefcase that had been his primary tool now sitting as evidence on the manager's floor. In the quiet confines of the police station, the final confirmation of his identity was found beneath the sleeves of his suit. The investigators rolled back the fabric to reveal the ink that time could not erase. There was the heart and the dagger, the anchor of a former life, and the initials USN that spoke of a history he had long since abandoned. Most telling was the scroll on his right forearm with the words, "Love to Dad," a sentimental marker on the skin of a man who had spent his life in the shadows. These tattoos were the map of his true self, a physical record that no alias or expensive tailoring could ever hope to cover. He had been on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list for exactly 2 months, a brief window of notoriety that ended in the quiet suburbs of Maryland. The journey back to California was a long, silent transit. Christensen was returned to the prison system, the life sentences for his previous robberies now joined by the consequences of his escape and his time on the run. The briefcase and the tailored suits were replaced by the coarse denim of a state uniform, and the stoop in his shoulders became a permanent fixture of his silhouette. He disappeared back into the gray corridors of the institution, a man who had tried to be an attorney but remained to the end a prisoner of his own history. The story of Kenneth Malcolm Christensen serves as a quiet postscript to an era of daring escapes, a reminder that the truth is often found in the smallest, most permanent details of who we are. As the cell door closed on the tall man from Chino, the focus of the investigators shifted elsewhere, to another man whose escape was far less calculated and far more chaotic. The chaos began in the quiet, sterile corridors of the Nashville Metropolitan Jail on a Friday afternoon that felt entirely ordinary to everyone but William Hutton Cobble. He was a man who understood the weight of a sentence, having just been handed 17 years for a daring bank robbery in the small town of Pulaski. The air in the jail was heavy with the scent of industrial floor wax and the faint metallic tang of old pipes. For most, this would be the end of the road, a place where the clock slowed down to a crawl. But Cobble was not a man who accepted the finality of a locked door. He sat in his cell, not in the rough denim of a common inmate, but in a crisp, well-tailored suit that he had been allowed to wear for his court appearance. It was this suit, this simple choice of fabric and cut, that would become his most effective tool of deception. He was 41 years old, a seasoned veteran of the criminal life who had already attempted to flee custody 3 times before. The authorities knew he was an escape risk, which is why federal marshals had left him at the Nashville jail for what they called safekeeping. They believed the local facility was a secure stopover before his eventual transfer to a federal penitentiary. Yet, the security of any institution is ultimately a human endeavor, and humans are prone to the lull of routine. On that afternoon of May 15th, 1964, a series of small, inexplicable oversights began to align. A turnkey named Donald E. Lee failed to turn a key. A cell door remained unlatched. A corridor was left momentarily unguarded. Cobble noticed the silence first. It was the kind of quiet that suggested the world had turned its head for just a moment. He stepped out of his cell and began to walk. He did not run, and he did not cast nervous glances over his shoulder. Instead, he adjusted his cuffs and walked with the measured, confident stride of a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. Have you ever noticed how easily we overlook the things that seem to fit the scenery? Cobble looked less like a prisoner and more like a visiting official or a legal professional. He moved through the jail, passing the heavy iron gates and the administrative offices, until he reached a section where another federal prisoner named Jack Gordon was being held. Gordon was sitting in the dim light of his cell when he looked up to see a well-dressed man standing in the hallway. Cobble did not look like a man in distress. He leaned against the bars and spoke in a polite, conversational tone. He asked Gordon if he might borrow a blanket for a few minutes. It was a strange request, but Cobble's appearance carried such a weight of authority that Gordon didn't think to question it. He saw the suit, the polished shoes, and the calm expression, and he reached the only logical conclusion his mind would allow. He assumed Cobble was a detective, perhaps a plainclothes officer working on a sensitive case within the jail. He handed the woolen blanket through the bars, a simple act of cooperation that would soon become a footnote in a major investigation. Cobble took the blanket and moved toward a nearby window. The room was filled with the soft, golden light of the afternoon sun, casting long rectangles across the floor. He folded the blanket carefully, pressing it against the glass with a practiced hand. The fabric was thick and heavy, designed to muffle sound and provide warmth. With a sudden, forceful shove, he broke the window pane. The sound was not a sharp, echoing crack, but a dull, suppressed thud that was easily swallowed by the ambient noise of the building. He cleared the jagged remnants of the glass, creating an opening just large enough for a man of his build. But before he climbed through, he did something that spoke to the strange, almost theatrical nature of his character. He walked back to Jack Gordon's cell. He reached through the bars and handed the blanket back to the confused prisoner. He offered a brief, polite word of thanks, as if he had merely borrowed a pen or a light for a cigarette. Then, he returned to the window. He climbed out onto the roof of the jail, the warm Nashville air hitting his face. Below him, the city was alive with a hum of traffic and the distant sounds of the afternoon. He crossed the roof with the same steady pace, eventually finding a way down to the street level. Within minutes, the man in the expensive suit had vanished into the crowd of pedestrians, a needle in a haystack of Saturday shoppers and office workers heading home for the weekend. Back inside the jail, the silence persisted. Jack Gordon stood in his cell, holding the blanket and staring at the broken window. It took several minutes for the reality of the situation to pierce through his confusion. When he finally realized that the detective had actually been a fleeing bank robber, he began to shout. He yelled for 15, perhaps 20 minutes, his voice echoing through the stone corridors. But the guards paid him no mind. They were accustomed to the noise of disgruntled inmates, and Gordon's cries were treated as nothing more than a nuisance. The staff continued their rounds, checking papers and drinking coffee, entirely unaware that their most high-profile prisoner was already miles away. The clock continued to tick, marking 6 full hours of undetected absence. It wasn't until the federal marshals returned to the jail later that evening that the comedy of errors reached its climax. They were there to check on their charge, to ensure that William Hutton Cobble was ready for his journey. When they asked one of the jail employees where their boy was, the answer was a look of blank confusion. The employee thought the marshals still had him in their custody, The realization spread through the office like a cold draft. They rushed to the cell, only to find it empty, the door swinging on its hinges. They found the broken window and the borrowed blanket, but the man who had used them was long gone. The fallout was immediate and severe. Chief Deputy Fate Thomas was forced to stand before the press and explain how a convicted bank robber had simply sauntered out of a secure facility in broad daylight. Suspensions were handed out, and an internal investigation was launched to determine how many points of failure had occurred in a single hour. The city was on edge, knowing that an escape artist was once again at large. Cobble had left behind a trail of embarrassment and a broken window. But he had also left a reminder of the fragility of order. He had proven that sometimes the most effective way to disappear is not to hide, but to stand in the light and pretend you belong there. As the sun set over Nashville, the search began in earnest. But the well-dressed man had a 6-hour head start on justice.